You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hahn,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Rachel Howzell Hall.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories. We've got a fantastic show for you today. But before we get started, I'd like to tell you about some sponsors. Jeff Sweat and his new book, Mayfly. It's actually a duology that's out now. You can join in the Mayfly quest at mayflybook.com. Start your journey. Long ago, a mysterious plague hit the city of L.A., decimating the population. Only children were immune. Ever since, no one lives past 17, and no one knows why. There are clues all over the city. Only the most determined will recognize them, and only the cleverest will be able to solve them. Life is short. Can you outlive it? Go to mayflybook.com to join the Mayfly quest today. And thanks to our friend Ernie Lindsay for sponsoring the show. His Sarah, the complete series, is on sale now. There's a link to it in the show notes. In Sarah, the complete series, a peaceful but hectic life is shattered for a mother and her children, along with her friends and colleagues, by kidnapping, murder, and vengeance. Those seeking retribution will go to any lengths. This bargain price collection contains over 600 pages of thrilling suspense, which includes all 3 novels in the Sarah series and the companion novella. Sarah, the complete series by Ernie Lindsay. Now stay tuned for the show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Rachel Howzell Hall on the show with me today. She has a fantastic new book called They All Fall Down, and I know you guys are really going to love this book. It has really captured my imagination. I know it will yours as well. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
You're so welcome. I'm happy to have you. Rachel, before we get into talking about all the good stuff we're going to cover today, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
I believe it was my first time thinking about being a storyteller was in 3rd grade. And I was probably coming from the Scholastic Book Fair at school, and I read Ramona the Brave, and I just really liked Ramona, and I thought she was pretty cool. And that kind of overlaid an assignment where we had to write a play. And I wrote a play called Blue Monday in 3rd grade, and it was about a girl who wakes up on a Monday and just everything just goes wrong. And I liked it. My teacher thought it was kind of strange and sad, but I liked telling a story that didn't have a happy ending, hence why I write what I write. So I think, that's when I really got into wanting to be a storyteller and to surround myself with books.
What age was this roughly?
So that's 3rd grade. So that's
okay,
so 10,
9, 10, somewhere in there.
9, 10, yeah.
That is,
and that was also the same age where I learned that I needed glasses too, because I was reading so much, and all of a sudden my reading scores dropped, and my mom couldn't understand what was happening. And so finally, she took me to the eye doctor. He's like, she needs glasses. So yeah, books helped me get diagnosed for needing glasses.
Well, that's a very astute thing for a youngster of 9, 10 in that range to start seeing the nuance of story and realizing that a story that does not necessarily have a happy ending can carry a different emotional weight. Did you start realizing the nuance of that, or you just like to torture people?
A little bit of both. Looking around at my life and comparing it to my friends' lives, they were totally kind of different. I grew up, pretty working class. Both my parents worked. There were 4 kids. We had money, but not a lot of it. We my parents were very creative with how to provide for us. And, I grew up in sort of a violent neighborhood with police helicopters and gun violence and a whole bunch of stuff. And it wasn't like like the Ramona the Brave. It wasn't that kind of childhood. While I was fascinated by, clean streets and riding your bikes and being safe, that wasn't really my reality. And my reality was a lot of police sounds and beatings in the alleys and all the rest of it. So my fascination and my wanting to write that came out of a need to kind of reflect what I grew up with and what my reality was. So, yeah, torturing people while at the same time, finding some type of family calm and quiet that's also in my stories, this
Right.
normality surrounded by total chaos.
Well, so you had this, what a lot of people would think of as an idyllic family life. You've got, siblings and, although both your parents work, they're creative and there was obviously a lot of love in the house, but then this juxtaposition of the neighborhood maybe not being that great, and then you take Ramona and, like you said, this really idyllic, picture book kind of life. Did you start adding, other reading material that more reflected what your real world experience was? And did art start to imitate life?
In some ways, I gravitated a lot toward, Stephen King and his mixing up the regular American household and American neighborhoods with these awful, awful things that lurk in between. And even though all these stories took place in Maine, I understood them and it scared me. And I saw a lot of my life in that. I think, that's Stephen King is that for a lot of people, where he takes something that seems so calm, a lovable dog or a clown, and just twists it. And I think that's why he's held on so long. We all see our lives somehow in that. And then a lot of my reading started to reflect that kind of thing. I was never one for romance because, if I read a romance, I want a bomb thrown in somewhere. Life can never just be that straightforward. And so, so Stephen King and Jackie Collins is probably the closest I got to romance. But even then, there were, dramatic things happening with Lucky Santangelo, the mob princess type thing. So, yeah, even in my so-called women's lit, I still needed that type of irritation to come and just wreck everything and to present problems.
Yeah. I've never really thought about it this way, but Stephen King is kind of a voice for our generation. I think you and I are pretty close in age and growing up in the 70s and 80s and seeing sitcom life then next to the fact that that we're latchkey kids and this sort of thing, and there's this real he had a way of telling stories that allowed us to compare the ideal with the reality in an over exaggerated way that maybe helped some of us keep our sanity through that time.
Right. I totally agree. I mean, just growing up where you are like the latchkey kid, and here you are in a house alone, and for a kid, that's actually kind of scary being there. All kinds of things can happen. I use my imagination a lot, even now, with just walking up the street and just the bad things that can happen to you when you're just walking down the street. And Stephen King does that. I mean, to this day, I stay away from sewers, really. I try to go around them and hop over them because I think of clowns hiding in the sewers.
Heck yeah.
That I wonder who it will be that voice for, like, my daughter's generation. Who will do that for them? Because he certainly did it for us.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So did you, as you went through high school and then, college and getting out into life, did writing, stay kind of front of mind for you?
I did in some ways, but back then in the 80s and early 90s, I didn't see many African-American women writing. I mean, you had Alice Walker and Toni Morrison, and they had to be these big, important books because these were big, important ideas. And while I had big ideas, I didn't want to write them like that. So I didn't really think that I could do something like write a book, and certainly not mystery or crime. It wasn't until I I started working for Penn Center USA West, which is a part of Penn Center. It's, Amnesty International for writers, basically. That one, I saw working writers, and two, I saw working writers who are also African American. And that's when I saw that I could do it, because these people, they're writing, that's, Jervy Turvalon and Gary Phillips, they're writing LA stories and regular people stories, and it doesn't have to be this big book on race, and it can be an entertaining thing. It can be an easy read type of thing. And that's when I started writing my first novel, A Quiet Storm, because I saw regular people doing this thing every day.
Well, Rachel, we talk a lot on the show about the power of story and how there's one thing to have big concepts and to really engage people and make them think and make them question the way they see the world, maybe make them look at the world differently through someone else's eyes and through their experience. And, more times than not, what we realize is that big, heady concepts are much more easily digested by a broader swath of people if they are couched in story about people we can relate to and about people that we care about. Did you start to realize that as you saw other working writers? I can tell stories that mean something to me. I can talk about concepts and things that are ultimately going to hopefully open people's eyes to different things, but I can also make it entertaining. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Right, and it wasn't until I started reading mystery and crime that's when I found my true voice, because I wanted to talk about these big things, but I didn't have the tool set or the interest really of writing these, in all caps, big important stories. I wanted it. And, I always think of, I grew up in church, and I always think about Jesus and the parables. He told parables, and they're very easy to understand, but heavy, heavy stories. You don't have to go on and on and on and on trying to get people to understand it. So I wanted to take that approach where, I want to talk about this, but I also want you to turn the page and have fun and laugh out loud and experience all the emotions. I want to be able to picture this scene in my head. And if that means I'm so-called genre, then that's fine, because that's my voice. That's who I am. That's how I get people to see what I'm trying to share with them. And I also think that's why mystery and crime just hangs on, and TV has thousands and thousands of iterations of SUV and, those types of things, because, while, cop finds this or a woman is this, people understand those things. We all see ourselves in these stories because crime and bad things happen to all of us. And crime and mystery, they have this setup that is so easy to share that lesson. There's some avenging, and there's some searching for the clues. There's all these elements that make compelling story that shares an idea, but you get it because it's in a format that we all kind of understand.
Right. And mystery and crime thrillers, really let us, deal with kind of the base nature of who we are. There's nothing that really kind of gets down to the bone quicker, no pun intended, to the reality of who we are and how we interact with each other. When you start to think about a new story and a new book starts to form, how does a story usually come alive to you? There are ideas everywhere, for writers, but sometimes there's a special idea that's just a little brighter than the rest. Is it usually a character? Is it a premise? Is it maybe a headline in the news? How do things usually spark up and come alive to you for a new story?
It's usually a headline in the news, or somebody's done a long-form article on this thing, and I keep seeing this idea, not because thousands of people are writing it, but this idea, this one thing keeps finding its way in front of me. And I tend to Evernote and web clip a lot of stuff, and it's always a news article, and it's always an idea that's either bothered me or fascinated me, and that's how my stories come. There's one thing that's happening right now. I'm seeing a lot of stories about lady reporters. And it's not because, thousands of people are writing about lady crime reporters. I think I'm starting to see them because an idea is somehow forming in my head about writing a story featuring a woman crime reporter. And eventually I'm going to start jotting things down on Post-it notes to figure out what this character, this lady reporter who is, following up on some weird murder or something, it's going to find its way in a book. But it's always news stories. And especially since I like, my favorite social media is Twitter. So I'm always on Twitter, and there's always something interesting that bubbles up from Twitter. Today was Sarah Weinman wrote a story about a woman crime reporter who, little did she know, was having a fling with a serial murderer. And it was just absolutely fascinating. And so I clipped that. And yesterday was another story about a crime reporter. So, yeah, it's always the news. I wish sometimes it was characters and, a big concept, but I don't have that talent.
Well, we all don't get visited by the muse in the same way. It's just how our minds work. What was the first book that you wrote that got published?
It was called A Quiet Storm, and it was published on the first anniversary of 9/11. So while it got great reviews and everything, the country's attention was obviously somewhere else, and so it did okay, but it didn't do great. But I really enjoyed that story. It was a difficult story. It was about mental illness in the African American community and how bad things happen when you ignore it. And so while there is a body and a disappearance, it was more psychological suspense. But that was the story I wanted to tell. My boss at the time, her son had disappeared from their home. He had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and so he came and went and stayed away. But this one last time, he was gone for good, and they still don't know where he is. And just watching her go through all that trauma and agony of, working with cops and social services on locating her son, it stayed with me. And I wanted to write that story about this dynamic young teacher who was diagnosed a while ago, but her family's always ignored it, especially with Black families who just recently started accepting psychiatric help, started going to shrinks and talking about their problems instead of just relying on, either ignoring it or praying it away. So I had lots of things to say about that subject, and so I wrote A Quiet Storm.
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities in in what your experience there with the African American community and the rural South where I'm from. There's so, those issues resonate just as deeply and loudly here as there. And and we need powerful stories to start peeling back the stigma and getting to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
In the last few years, you've been writing a Detective Eloise Norton series, and the new book is not about Eloise; it's a standalone. But I'm fascinated by that series. Can you tell us a little bit about Eloise and how she came to you?
Well, after A Quiet Storm, I couldn't land a book deal. I think at the time there was this huge movement of so-called street lit with Sister Soldier and those types of books, and that wasn't who I was. I wrote about crime and bad things, but not in that style. And I think at that time a lot of editors had an idea of what they thought was Black life, and while it was for some, it wasn't for all of us. And
as if there's one Black life, right?
Yeah. I mean, people think poor Black and they think snow and tenements and that kind of thing. Whereas, in LA, we have blue sky and palm trees, and you can still be poor. And those palm trees are riddled with, bullets. But so it was hard for me to get another book deal. In that time, my husband and I, we wanted to start our family, and I got pregnant, and I was also at the same time diagnosed with a rare type of breast cancer while pregnant. And I had to have treatment for that while pregnant because the tumor was being fed by my pregnancy. So my daughter was born. She was born healthy. And then 3 years later, I experienced another kind of cancer thing. And at this point, I'm like, oh my God, I may not make it to 50. What am I going to do? And I wanted to write a crime story. By this time, I'd read both Terry McMillan and Walter Mosley. And I was thinking, it's like, what if I could write something like Terry McMillan meets Walter Mosley? And that had been working in my mind. And then with all the cancer stuff, that's when I'm like, I'm going to write this story. It's going to be a procedural. It's going to be a detective story. And the woman detective is going to be like my friends and me, grew up in Los Angeles in my part of town, and she's going to solve crimes in this part of Los Angeles that you don't read about. And that's how Lou got started. My husband's like, cool, because he wanted me to do the things I wanted to do, because while he wasn't, getting cut up and having to take tamoxifen once a day, he also was going through this cancer thing with me. And so he sent me to my first conference, Writers Police Academy. And he sent me, when I say sent me, I mean, he sponsored, because conferences are not cheap. He insisted that I go to BoucherCon. Meanwhile, he's helping take care of our daughter while I'm doing all these things and drafting these drafts early on Sunday mornings at the Ralph's parking lot, the Ralph's supermarket parking lot. So finally, I had this first draft. And it was an honest first draft because at this time, I didn't have an agent and I didn't have a contract. So I was writing this for me. And I finally sent it out. Some editors, some agents didn't like my voice, which I had been used to hearing. And then it only takes one. And Jill Marshall was that one, who is still my agent today. And she absolutely loved it. And we found a publisher for it who absolutely loved it. And we found readers who absolutely loved Eloise because she was someone who hadn't been in between pages before, talking about an LA that they hadn't known about before. Of course, LA is one of those cities where movies and TV, you think you know LA, but you don't know all of LA. And readers got to meet the place where I grew up, the place where rich Blacks and poor Blacks are, going to the same church and to the same grocery store. So yeah, it's resonated a lot with people, and I absolutely love Lou, and I hope one day to be able to pick her back up and write some more of her adventures.
Oh, please do. Please do. That would be amazing. Do you attribute that first Lou book finding an audience and finding publishing? Do you attribute that to maybe the market had changed and was more willing to hear other voices than what they had preconceived? Or do you attribute it to the time in your life and the urgency of that and writing the book for yourself? Or is it some combination of the two that you think this book really resonated with people the way it did?
I want to say it's a combination of both, because I am not convinced yet that the market is as open to diverse voices as we like to think. One of the reasons why I haven't been able to write another Lou book is because of the red line, sales. And I would like to, and there are readers, but, there are not enough readers for me to keep going with it. But at the same time, I think because it was written from a different place than, I got to write this because it needs to sell, I think readers can tell that my urgency is coming across in these pages. I want people to look and see, and readers they discern that. So I think it's a mixture of both. We still have a lot of work to do in terms of getting writers like me out there with the wider readership. But we're better than what we were in the early 2000s, almost definitely. I think publishers see that there is an audience. I think Black cinema has a lot to do with that. Jordan Peele has made it so that Black nerds like me are there. He's making movies that are beyond the slave movies, the big ideas, the most important story. They're all important stories, and he's helping audiences see that we can write, we meaning African Americans and people of color, we can write and we can sing and we can do all this art that relates to class, but it's and race, but it's not just this one genre, this literary fiction type genre that we're all relegated to. You can find our experiences in all genres, and you'll be entertained.
Right.
You will be entertained.
Did you see that Jordan Peele is rebooting The Twilight Zone?
I think it's perfect.
I'm so excited about that.
Get CBS all access. We've been trying to hold out. He wanted to get it when Star Trek came out.
Yeah.
So I think now we're just going to bite the bullet.
Oh yeah.
But that's exciting. And
yes.
Once again, that's taking something that is known and putting a different spin on that. A lot of editors will say, well, yeah, all detective stories are alike. No, they're not. I mean, my Los Angeles is totally different from Michael Connelly's Los Angeles. And that's a beautiful thing. I think that's great. There's value in, yes, taking a known trope and having someone else's spin on that trope.
Well, and Los Angeles is kind of the perfect backdrop because you've got Michael Connelly's view of Los Angeles and Harry Bosch, and he's showing us pieces of Los Angeles that I've never seen and probably, never will get. And then you're showing me another side of it and, countless others because, how many millions of people are there and how many?
Right. 10 million people.
Yeah. And square mile after square mile. It's a magical place. And, why can't we all have our view of it and tell, the kinds of stories that, that just capture imaginations all over? I think it's fantastic.
Right. I agree. Yeah. I mean, even with Walter Mosley, his Los Angeles is different from mine. Los Angeles. His is a 50s, 60s from a Black male perspective in a different part of Los Angeles than my, Gen Xer, West Side, Black area. It's a totally different read.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, let's talk about the new book. They All Fall Down has been out for a couple of days now. And this is a different story from what you've been doing, previously, but man, is this a fantastic story.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. Tell me about Miriam Macy and how does this escapade get started?
Miriam Macy came out of a few places. She is a mom, and I am a mom. This came out when a lot of mothers were doing the most for their kids, meaning going online and bullying kids and beating kids up and just crazy, crazy mom parent things. And, I was coming out of my whole cancer experience, and I don't even remember what I saw, but I said to my husband, being a mom, you just start crying watching commercials, certain commercials which trigger you. And, I told him I'd do anything for our daughter. And it's like I actually meant that. But then I started reading these stories about these women just losing their minds for their kids, like the Texas cheerleading mom. That's just straight crazy. So that story, those types of stories just always stayed with me. And at this time when I was writing, the writer's strike had just probably finished, and there were all these reality shows showing just awful, awful people getting all this attention. And so that was happening. And the thought that I'd had of writing a story like this had always kind of hovered around in the back of my head. I grew up Seventh-day Adventist, and in that religion, we have a lot of don'ts, and if you do, then you're going to hell type of thing.
Right.
And so, that kind of all stayed with me. And then being an English American Lit major, having to read all the classics like Canterbury Tales and Dante's Inferno. So the story has always been in my mind's closet, and I just didn't know what to do with that until I saw Seven with Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt. And I wanted to write a story like that. But again, it's like, well, how do I do that? And it wasn't until I started writing the Norton series that I had enough tools in my tool case, and I had lived enough life as a mother to attack a story like this. And so I didn't tell my agent or my editor what I was doing. And I started reading a lot of locked room mysteries, and I just started drafting this story. And it finally became a true thing where I had a draft to say, this is actually a story. And that's when I started attacking it very, zealously. I just went at it and shaped it. And there it was. And I showed my agent, and she loved it. And the rest is history. Here we are 2 days after, its publication.
Yeah. So tell people kind of what the setup for the story is. You told us a little of the motivation. What do we find ourselves in this book? But this is not a traditional like crime thriller where someone is unraveling the mystery after the fact. What do we find ourselves in as the book opens?
So 7 people, 7 sinners, including Miriam Macy, are invited to this private island off the coast of Mexico. And they each have been invited for different reasons until they find out on the island that they're all there for the same reason. And one by one, their sins come out and they're punished accordingly. So that's the story, basically. Again, I was thinking about Survivor, and there was another Fox
real stakes
show about. I wanted all of America basically on this island, and I wanted to talk about how we are all sinners in some ways, and that we all have these shortcomings, and sometimes you don't even know that you have this problem until someone pulls you aside and tells you. And so a lot of these characters that are on the island have no idea that their problem is as bad as it is. And Miriam, especially, she is, again, she's this devoted parent, and she justifies her actions. And we all do that, you know. We all justify why we told that lie or why we took that money, why we did do anything we do, even down to why we ate, you know, the Big Mac meal and some of those other fries over there. You know, we can justify anything we do. But in the end, you know, you eat Taco Bell at age 50, you're going to get payback for doing that, right?
That's right. Your Stephen King influences really shine through in this book, and the you know, the idea of the norm having a weird spotlight shown on it. I also grew up in a kind of hyper religious background where there's there's a devil behind every bush, and everything is sin. And you know, it's when you come, you know, as you grow and mature and all that, the you know, one of the downfalls of maturing past some of that is to think that nothing is evil.
Right.
And what a great, you know, juxtaposition that you have in this book, that there is evil, there is, we do have problems that we need to address. And having those shown to us, you know, reinstates our humanity and lets us wrestle with those things again, without the judgment. Yeah, there's just something about story, having those things shown to us, in a non-preachy manner,
right,
with characters that we can relate to, really helps us understand ourselves.
Yeah, no, like you said, Stephen King and parables. It's very simple, and you think it's just, you know, a camel getting into heaven easy through the eye of a needle or whatever that was is easier than whatever. It's just a very simple thought, and sometimes, you know, people discount that, but then you start peeling it back, and it's like, oh, wait, I think that's why, you know, I'm excited about Twilight Zone and confused when some people are saying, oh, I hope he doesn't make it social political. And it's like, well, that's what Rod Serling was all about.
Yeah,
you know,
wasn't it always?
It looks like this easy story of a neighborhood whose lights have all gone out. But no, it's not about that. It's about the McCarthy era. It's about all these, like, very complicated things made easy so that you can understand you are the monster. Right. You are the monster. Yeah.
Well, and one of the brilliant things is that a lot of Twilight Zone episodes, in the same way in your book, is that there's not always a tidy bow placed on the story at the end of the story, and you close the cover and you say, well, Rachel told me everything that I ever need to know about this, and I can go on about my life because now I know. Some of the best stories leave us a little unsettled at the end, and allow that story to roll over in our mind, for months and years to come. When you're writing typical, like, police procedural, sometimes it is a more definitive end to the book. Yeah. Was writing this kind of story more satisfying in that way?
Well, in some ways it was, but I would say even for some of the Lou Norton stories, while there's an ending, there's not true endings. I mean, you're left with, well, why are people doing these things? Why did this guy leave this poor girl hanging in a closet? And what does that say about, you know, young women and sexuality? And it's still, you know, yes, she caught the bad guy, but there are so many bad guys and there are so many young girls, and it just keeps going and going. And I believe it was in the third of the Lou Norton, well, definitely the fourth, where Lou just feels overwhelmed by all of it because it's just never ending. And with They All Fall Down, you know, in some ways this could be a series because there are so many sinners and we do so many bad things to each other that it can be like a Catalina boat just going back and forth to this island with people who need, you know, some type of payback. because there are no true resolutions. It's like you never see just one roach, you never
Right.
see just one ant. You lift up a cup and there they all are. And even then, there's some over there and some over there. And so, yeah, I like writing my stories so that, yes, we're at page 375, but gee whiz, no, we still have some work to do.
Right. The Catalina boat, that's a very Los Angeles reference.
Yes, it is.
Yes.
It's Catalina Island for those. It's an island off of Los Angeles. And the Wrigley family, the Wrigley gum family, they had an estate over there. So yes,
interesting.
and they're buffalo, and I didn't want to put it in Catalina because it was too close to Los Angeles, and it was also America.
Right.
I wanted it to be an exotic location.
Well, the book is They All Fall Down. It is available everywhere now in hardcover and Kindle edition audiobook. Rachel, I think I'm going to get the audio and listen to it
I am too.
This next coming week because I'm excited to go through the story again, but to hear someone else interpret it. So that's going to be fun, I think. Rachel, if people are just learning about you and want to dig into your back catalog and find out more and follow along with news coming up, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Find me at Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Rachel Howzell. My Facebook is Rachel Howzell Hall, and my website is www.rachelhowzell.com. So
Excellent.
Please come and join me in one of those places.
Absolutely. I'm going to put links to all that in the show notes to the episode. Rachel, I'm a huge fan of what you're doing, and we wish you much success on the new book.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hedwig slipped into David's den, the circular reading room. A ladder of crude rungs protruded from the wall, remnant of its days as a grain silo. He pulled himself upward, rung by rung, until the bookcases and sofas were far below. Even if he fell and died, he didn't really care anymore. No, he did care. He couldn't die yet. She had to die first. That would make their divorce final if she wanted it so much. Darkness enveloped him. He reached the top of the ladder and stepped off onto a catwalk of black mesh, lit only by the faint light of the 4 square windows that encircled the turret. From this perch he could see the exit she would use. He felt like an assassin, like Lee Harvey Oswald in the window of the Texas schoolbook depository. But he wouldn't use a rifle, no. Rifles leave evidence. Rifles can be produced in court. Rifles can miss. He pulled back a shroud of burlap and opened the cardboard box he'd stashed up here earlier that day. He reached into it and withdrew the only murder weapon, the only magic bullet a Van Brunt could ever need. The gold lantern flashed in the moonlight. He held it up to the window. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, he thought. And then it's time for a midnight ride. But it won't be Paul Revere. No, not Paul Revere at all. He found the oyster knife at last. He lay his cupped palm sideways over the vent. Don't get blood on your Armani. And stabbed the blade into his palm. The blood came hot. He dripped it into the lantern, where the skull of the horseman waited to sip it like nectar. The reliquary glowed, and an incantation in Old Dutch appeared, shining from within the metal. It was time. Hedwig bent and whispered into the vents. Rise, headless, and ride. The letters vanished, and a cold white light burst from the thing. The skull wasn't just a skull anymore. It had gestated. Capillaries clung to it the way fine hair clings to the crown of a newborn. A thick, carotid artery moved with snake-like undulation, drinking blood from the pool at the base, pulling it upwards to circulate through scarlet vessels, through twisting coils, slurping the liquid greedily. the way little Zeph used to slurp strawberry Nesquik through a crazy straw. The blood pulsed and pushed into the nose, into the eyes, into the hollow cavity within the skull. But was it hollow still? Hedwig didn't think so. He felt a mind growing there, something with a will to challenge his own. He fixed his gaze to the twin caverns of its eye sockets, speaking slowly and deliberately. Jessica Bridge. The death's head grin broadened somehow, and a thread of black and green liquid, shiny as a horsefly's wings, trickled from the gap of a missing eye tooth. Only Jessica Bridge. Do you understand? He shook the lantern. Do you understand? The face lurched forward and struck the glass, leaving a red splash there. It wobbled and settled, smiling and nodding. Jessica Bridge, hissed the face. Yes. Hedwig raised the lantern a little. Jessica Bridge. The red face tipped backwards and the jaw cracked wide. Hedwig recoiled. Something pink and wet writhed inside that mouth. The nub of a new tongue, salivating as if it could taste the name. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge. Jessica Bridge.